Claudio, the protagonist, was always a man devoted to his family. He worked as a nurse, a profession that required patience, compassion, and a great deal of care for others. He took pride in his work, caring for people and being a constant presence in times of pain and need. Claudio always believed that his dedication to his family, as well as his profession, was enough to guarantee happiness in his marriage to Carla. They had been together for years, and although the routine of marriage had replaced their initial passion, Claudio never doubted the love he felt for his wife. But something was beginning to erode his confidence. Carla, his wife, constantly commented that he was more feminine than a man should be. Over time, these criticisms began to deeply affect Claudio. What he did, the way he behaved, even his profession began to be seen by Carla as a sign of weakness, a lack of virility. Even though he was a strong and capable man at work, in his marriage he saw himself as an unfulfilled figure in his wife's eyes. He began to question his masculinity, who he truly was. He knew he was dedicated, that he loved his family, but he couldn't meet Carla's expectations, as she seemed perpetually dissatisfied. Claudio didn't want to be that insecure man, but as the years passed and the criticism intensified, he began to lose himself. He tried to please, tweaked little details, tried to be the ideal husband, but nothing seemed to be enough. Carla, on the other hand, had always been a very beautiful woman who grew up in an environment where expectations about marital roles were very rigid. She believed that to maintain a happy relationship, her husband needed to be strong, assertive, and, of course, always in control. Carla wasn't evil, but she had her own insecurities, things she'd never shared with anyone. She internalized this idea that her marriage needed to fit a specific mold, and Claudio wasn't fulfilling the expected role. She began to feel frustrated, not because she didn't love Claudio, but because she felt something was missing in the relationship. He was a dedicated man, yes, but he didn't match her idea of a real man. This lack of emotional alignment began to create a rift between them, and over time, Beatrice began to question what she truly wanted from life and the relationship. She loved Claudio, but she could no longer find the connection she once had, which led to frustration and a growing feeling of incompleteness. When Carla met Juliana, a strong, independent woman, without the same expectations about what a relationship should be, her life began to take an unexpected turn. Juliana entered her life steadily, but as they grew closer, Carla began to realize there was more to her than she imagined. Juliana wasn't interested in gender stereotypes or traditional marital roles. She lived her life according to her own rules, without worrying about what others thought. This freedom caught Carla's attention, and little by little, she began to open up to a new reality. Juliana represented an emotional freedom for Carla that she never knew she craved. With Juliana, Carla felt more authentic, without the pressure to conform to a predetermined mold. It was a feeling of complete acceptance, something she had never experienced with Claudio. When Carla realized she was falling in love with Juliana, she was torn. She loved Claudio, but her emotional connection with him was fading, while her relationship with Juliana began to fill the void she had felt for so long. Juliana, on the other hand, was a woman who, unlike Carla, wasn't bound by traditional relationship patterns. She was a determined, strong woman with a modern vision of what love should be. She wasn't just a woman Beatrice felt physically attracted to, but someone who offered an emotional freedom Carla never had. Juliana didn't care what society thought of her relationships, and her open and authentic approach to love made Carla deeply question her marriage to Claudio. Juliana's presence was a turning point for Carla. She began to realize that her marriage was trapped by expectations that no longer reflected who she truly was. She was no longer willing to live up to the expectations of a traditional marriage, much less deny her feelings for Juliana. Carla's decision to become emotionally involved with Juliana was the breaking point with Claudio. She began to free herself from the constraints she had imposed on her life. Claudio, in turn, felt the pain of betrayal not only because of what Carla was doing, but also because of how he felt about himself. He had always prided himself on being a dedicated man, but over time his identity was challenged by Carla's constant pressure. He believed that work, caring for the home and family were enough to guarantee her love, but he failed to recognize. Claudio searched for answers in her words, trying to understand how he could be the man she desired. He knew his work as a nurse was important, but Carla never seemed satisfied with his professional choices. When he arrived late from a long shift at the hospital, she would already be in bed, distracted, or worse, making comments about how little he was involved at home, as if he were incapable of balancing his career with family life. Even when he tried to be more present, helping with household chores or suggesting a weekend together, Carla's responses were always cold. "You're good at taking care of everyone, Claudio, but what about me?" she would say with a sigh. The conflict wasn't just Carla's expectations of his masculinity. Her dissatisfaction also stemmed from a deeper disillusionment, something Claudio still couldn't grasp. He felt lost, searching for a void in his marriage that he didn't know how to fill. Every criticism, no matter how subtle, left him even more confused about what Carla really wanted from him. The doubt Claudio carried within himself, beginning to question who he was and what it truly meant to be a man of worth, began to affect every aspect of his life. He wondered if he was being genuine with himself, or if he was simply trying to please someone who would never seem satisfied with who he was. He felt as if he were losing himself, as if his identity were a fluid thing, shaped by someone else's expectations, and this made him question the very foundation of his relationship. But despite all this, growing insecurity, Claudio couldn't give up hope that he could be the man Carla wanted. He clung to this belief, thinking that if he changed enough, she would finally see him the way he'd always dreamed. This desire to be accepted and loved drove him to sacrifice even more, to try to be the ideal man for Carla, even without knowing who that man might be. He felt trapped in a vicious cycle of self-criticism and insecurity, constantly feeling like he wasn't up to par. The marriage, which had once seemed like a partnership, was now mired in an uncomfortable silence. And Claudio, despite all his effort and dedication, no longer knew how to make Carla see the man he believed he was. He tried to adjust, but he increasingly distanced himself from the essence of who he truly was. The internal conflict between being himself and being what Carla expected of him became increasingly painful and difficult to deal with. And it was in this context of growing frustration, with Claudio feeling increasingly lost and directionless, that the situation began to intensify. He didn't know what to do to change the situation, but something inside him told him that for the marriage to survive, he would need to understand himself better. However, he didn't yet realize that the first step to a solution wasn't changing to please Carla, but rather seeking the truth about who he really was, free from the molds imposed by the relationship. The sun was setting on the horizon, tinting the walls of Claudio and Carla's apartment a soft orange. It was an ordinary late afternoon, like so many others they had shared, but at that moment the air was charged with a silent tension, as if something invisible was about to break. Claudio was sitting on the sofa, absently leafing through a medical book, while Carla, in the kitchen, seemed more distant than ever. Their eyes avoided contact, and the heavy atmosphere between them was something Claudio could no longer ignore. Long ago, their relationship became an emotional battleground. The words Carla used to describe him, constantly diminishing his masculinity, began to silently but effectively erode his self-esteem. "You're very sensitive, Claudio. You seem more like a woman than a man," she would say with a sly laugh, as if it were a harmless joke, but he knew there was more to it. He constantly tried to conform to Carla's standards, trying to fit into a model of masculinity that wasn't his, just to please her.
He believed that if he were the man she'd been waiting for, she would finally love him fully, as he'd always wanted. But deep down, something was breaking. Their relationship, which initially seemed built on love and understanding, was eroding their trust, and Claudio found himself constantly seeking answers in Carla's words, as if it were the only way to please her. He distanced himself from his true essence, from who he truly was, all to meet the expectations of a woman who, seemingly, never accepted him for who he truly was. That afternoon, as the daylight slowly faded, Carla entered the room with a serious expression. Claudio watched her with the feeling that something was about to happen, something he dreaded but couldn't prevent. She sat beside him, brushing her hair back from her face with a mechanical gesture, as if preparing to speak what had been on her mind for weeks. "Claudio, I need to tell you something," she began, her voice low but carrying a weight that seemed to displace the air between them. I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm in love with someone else, with a woman." The words fell like heavy stones, and Claudio felt paralyzed, as if the ground had dropped out from under him, and he was floating, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. His mind, already in shock, tried to process the information, but nothing made sense. Carla was in love with another woman? How was that possible? He had spent his entire life trying to be the ideal husband, molding himself to her wishes, and now he was confronted with a revelation he couldn't understand. The silence between them was deep, almost suffocating, as Carla stared at him with teary eyes as if waiting for some kind of reaction. But Claudio didn't know what to say. He wanted to scream, to question, to demand an explanation, but his words seemed stuck in his throat. What would he do with this information? How would he react? He felt a mixture of anger, confusion, and despair, but above all, he felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if the air had suddenly been taken away. Carla's revelation was more than just an emotional betrayal. It shattered everything Claudio believed to be the foundation of their relationship. He'd always thought his insecurity about his own masculinity was something controllable, that he just had to mold himself to please his wife. But the truth she revealed was a brutal reality check. He hadn't been enough for her, not in the way he'd thought. He had lost himself trying to be something he wasn't, and now she was exchanging him for someone he didn't even understand. Carla's words swirled in his mind. "I fell in love with Marcella. She gives me something you never could," she said bluntly, as if it were an inevitable fact. These words tore at Claudio's heart, and he felt the pain of each one as if they were being engraved on his soul. He thought about everything he'd done for her, how he'd always sacrificed for the relationship, how he had tried to be the perfect husband, but in the end, it seemed his efforts had been for nothing. He felt an immense emptiness inside, a feeling that he no longer knew who he was or what he was doing there. The man he had imagined himself to be, the man he thought Carla loved, was gone. The pain of betrayal was only part of the suffering. What truly tore him apart was the realization that he had lost his identity, that he had been transformed into something he wasn't meant to please others. He realized that by trying to mold himself to Carla, he was denying his own essence from his own needs and desires. He no longer knew what it meant to be himself. In a moment of deep reflection, he found himself questioning his own identity. What did he really want from life? Who was he beyond the persona Carla forced him to be? He began to realize that his life up until now had been built based on Carla's expectations, not his own. He didn't know what to make of this revelation, this pain, but one thing was clear: he could no longer live this way. He walked away from Carla, not with anger or resentment, but with a sense of profound sadness and loneliness. He needed time for himself, to understand what he truly wanted and who he truly was. From that point on, he entered a cycle of reflection and self-discovery, trying to understand what Carla's betrayal meant to him and how he could rebuild his life from the pain he felt. But the answer wasn't simple. He felt that somehow Carla herself had become a stranger to him. She was no longer the woman he'd known. His feelings were shattered, and despite the pain, he knew that now the only person who could rebuild his life was himself. He would have to find his own path without depending on others' expectations, beginning to free himself from the shackles of a relationship that from that moment on had ceased to be healthy. This moment of rupture in which Claudio was forced to confront not only Carla's betrayal, but also his own insecurities and limitations, was the starting point for a new journey of self-discovery and transformation. He would need to learn to rebuild himself emotionally and rebuild his identity without losing himself in the judgments and expectations of others. After Carla's devastating revelation, Claudio found himself adrift, immersed in a sea of questions and insecurities. The pain of betrayal was overwhelming, but even though the wound in his heart was raw, the discovery that his identity was deeply shaped by his wife's
deconstructing the idea of a model man imposed by society. He learned about deconstructing toxic masculinity and how, often, the pressure to be an idealized version of oneself can be detrimental to mental health. Claudio began to understand that his relationship with Carla and the frustration he felt weren't about being less of a man, but about him not being true to his own feelings and identity. One of the greatest lessons Claudio learned during this process of self-discovery was acceptance. He realized that true peace wouldn't come from external approval, like Carla's, but from self-acceptance. He needed to learn to accept himself, with all his strengths and weaknesses, without submitting to the judgment of others, especially Carla, who until then seemed to control who he should be. He understood that the change he needed wasn't in trying to be what others wanted, but in accepting himself as he was, without guilt or fear of failure. As the months passed, Claudio became more aware of his emotional needs and how they had been neglected for so long. He began engaging in new activities that brought him pleasure and a sense of personal fulfillment, such as photography and yoga. He sought out moments of solitude where he could reconnect with himself and reflect on what he truly wanted from life. With each passing day, he moved further away from external expectations and closer to who he truly wanted to be. He learned to take his mental and emotional health more seriously, something he had never done before, immersing himself fully in his own healing process. Claudio began to understand that his identity wasn't tied to what Carla or society expected of him. He realized that self-love was fundamental to any healthy relationship, and that he couldn't give himself completely to his marriage, to his wife, or to what she expected of him without first loving and respecting himself as an individual. This didn't mean he no longer loved her, but that he needed to first love himself genuinely and without imposed expectations. Over time, Claudio began to distance himself emotionally from Carla, no longer out of anger or hurt, but with the awareness that he didn't need to submit to this relationship to feel valid. He could no longer be the man Carla desired, but certain that he was enough as he was, he decided to take the step toward what he truly needed, to be free to be himself. Deep down, he knew he couldn't continue a relationship where he wasn't accepted in his entirety, and that to be happy, he would first need to free himself from this emotional prison he had created. The process of rediscovery wasn't easy. Claudio's journey was filled with doubts, insecurities, and moments of loneliness. But in the end, he understood that true freedom came from acceptance. He didn't need to be what Carla or anyone else wanted. The only thing he truly needed to be was himself, without masks, without external expectations, and with the certainty that by accepting his true identity, he was taking the first step toward true happiness. The end of that journey still seemed distant to Claudio,
But at the same time, there was something inside him that indicated that the real journey was just beginning. After months of self-discovery, reflection, and moments of profound anguish, he was finally reaching a point where the shadow of what had happened between him and Carla was beginning to lose its strength. He was no longer being pulled into old patterns of dissatisfaction, frustration, or worse yet, self-sabotage. It was a Saturday morning when Claudio found himself sitting on a park bench, watching the children play and the leaves dance in the gentle breeze. The sun touched his face warmly, and he felt, for the first time in a long time, a sense of peace. He was there on that bench, simply existing. There were no more pressures to be something he wasn't. There were no more inner voices questioning his masculinity or Carla's inquisitive looks. He was just himself. And most importantly, he allowed himself to be that way, without fear of judgment. Little by little, the painful memories of the days he spent with Carla, desperately trying to fit into a mold that was never his, began to fade. There was no longer room for resentment or anger. Claudio no longer wanted to live in a cycle of self-criticism. He no longer wanted to blame himself for who he was. He was allowing himself to grow and understand that true strength lies not in conforming to others' expectations, but in accepting oneself, imperfections notwithstanding. This process of acceptance was difficult, but necessary. Throughout his journey, he realized that often the greatest enemy we face is our own fear of being who we are. This fear makes us seek validation where there is none, leads us to toxic relationships, and creates internal barriers that prevent us from living fully. Claudio learned that to be happy, he would need to face these fears and, more importantly, forgive himself. The guilt of not putting himself first for so long began to dissolve as he understood that there was no shame in taking care of himself. He forgave himself for the times he forgot his own identity, and this freed him from a burden he had carried for years. And it was with this freedom that Claudio began to see life differently. The work that had previously defined him became just a part of his journey, not the reason for his existence. The relationships he cultivated became more genuine, based more on the exchange of experiences and mutual support. He allowed himself to go out, make new friends, and, for the first time, discover who he truly wanted to be, outside of Carla's or anyone else's expectations. There was something liberating about making choices for himself, about allowing himself to experience things without needing the approval of others. Claudio began exploring old hobbies he'd neglected, like photography and mountain biking. Long walks around the city, now accompanied by a new perspective, became precious moments of self-discovery. He encountered landscapes that had previously gone unnoticed in his hurried daily life, and began to perceive the beauty in life's small details. Every piece of nature, every smile from strangers, every new friendship he formed gave him a sense of personal fulfillment. As he reconnected with the world and others, he also began to reflect on his relationship with Carla. He knew he could no longer return to that place of insecurity and emotional dependence. Their relationship no longer existed, at least not in the way he had envisioned. However, he decided that while the pain of betrayal still lingered, he would not allow it to define him. Claudio didn't seek revenge, nor did he seek to expose Carla or punish her in any way. On the contrary, he understood that the best way to move forward was to forgive her. Forgiving Carla didn't mean accepting what she had done, but rather freeing herself from the pain she had caused. He no longer wanted to live in the shadow of what had happened. And that's when he realized the true power of forgiveness. It wasn't about Carla or what she had done, but about him, about his own peace. He needed to forgive so he could free himself emotionally and move on with his life. He began to realize that forgiveness wasn't an achievement of the other person, but a personal achievement. By releasing the weight of resentment, he gave himself the chance to grow and rebuild himself, embracing his true identity without worrying about what others thought. He understood that a person's worth lies not in others' expectations of them, but in their own perception of themselves. When he finally accepted this, everything in his life began to fall into place. He found an inner peace he never knew was possible. Meanwhile, Carla's life continued, but Claudio knew he could no longer live tied to what she wanted or expected of him. He no longer sought her approval. His journey was now about his own truth, about being authentic and living life according to his own values and desires. Claudio's story is one of self-improvement, of learning, of growth. He went from being an insecure man, trapped by other people's expectations, to someone who knew his worth, someone who allowed himself to be who he truly was. And with that, he found freedom. Not a freedom from revenge or anger, but a freedom to live fully, to embrace each moment with confidence and acceptance. And now, with a lighter heart and a calmer soul, Claudio feels ready for the next chapter of his life. But will he be able to handle the unexpected fate has in store for him? Or perhaps this new beginning will bring new challenges even more profound than he ever imagined. Stay tuned to find out what happens in the next story, where what seemed like the end may just be the beginning of something even greater. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters of this journey of self-discovery and overcoming obstacles. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing you moving and inspiring stories like this one.